Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Book Talk event at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers, co-hosted by Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs. I'm Indu Saxena, Deputy Director of the Consortium. We at CIP are very pleased to host this book talk titled The Indo-Pacific Empire, China, America, and the Contest for the World's Pivotal Region, authored by renowned scholar, expert, Professor Rory Medcalf. Before diving into the substance, I would like to invite Director of the Consortium, Dr. Ernest Gunasekara Rockwell, for his initial remarks and to tell a bit about the Consortium. Doc, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Indu. And no matter how many times we do this, you always catch me off guard with that. I want to thank Dr. Metcalf for being here with us. I really appreciate you being here. It really speaks volumes to the work that that Indu has been doing in upping our ante as to the quality of researchers that we're bringing onto these book talks. The consortium is a new institution that we started back in February of this year. The Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs was just growing too big for one man to be able to tackle on his own. And so I reached out to LinkedIn to see who could help me out. And I just expected a few stragglers to kind of chime in and say that they'd help me out. Instead, at this point, we've got about 60 volunteers helping us out. And Indu, just one of the very first ones to come on and just really shined for us, and that's why I promoted her quite rapidly to the deputy director. So thank you for all your help in getting these things accomplished and for making the consortium a success. These book talks I think are very helpful in bringing the stuff, the topics and the scholars are at the top of the field to an audience that is eager to hear what exactly this Indo-Pacific is. And I can't think of anyone better to try to inform us than Dr. Metcalf. So I'm going to hand it back over to you, and I'll chime back in at the end of the session to kind of let folks know what some of the other projects that we're working on are. And in the meantime, I'll just keep my mouth quiet. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc, for your kind words and your continuous support. Let me read the disclaimer here. The views and opinions expressed or implied in this event are those of the participants and should not be construed as carrying the official sanctions of the Department of Defense, Air Force, Air Education and Training Command, Air University, or other agencies or departments of the US government or their international equivalents. Now, please allow me to introduce our today's esteemed speaker, Professor Rory Medcalf. Professor Medcalf is head of the National Security College at the Australian National University. His career spans diplomacy, intelligence analysis, think tanks, academia, and journalism, including as founding director of the security program at Lowy Institute in government. Professor Metcalf was a senior strategic analyst with the Office of National Assessment, Australia's peak intelligence agency, and a diplomat with service in India, Japan, and Papua New Guinea. He now plays a lead role in informal diplomacy among a range of Indo-Pacific powers. He has contributed to 3 landmark international reports on nuclear arms control and was an advisor for Australia's 2016 Defense White Paper. Professor Medcalf is recognized globally as a thought leader on the Indo-Pacific strategic concept, as articulated in his acclaimed 2020 book Contest for the Indo-Pacific, published internationally as Indo-Pacific Empire. He is a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum, Register for Experts and Eminent Persons, the board of the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations, and the Scientific Advisory Council of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Rory Medcalf to present a brief overview of his book. Please type your questions in the chat box. Professor Medcalf, the stage is yours. Medcalf, you are muted. Professor Medcalf. Professor Metcalf, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Indo. And I'm sorry, I think my Wi-Fi dropped out for just a moment there, but I'm back. Very happy to be part of this event and really privileged to be invited. I've got a lot of respect for the work of the journal, and it's great that you've got this consortium of researchers really coming together on this very new and relevant way of framing our strategic environment. What I'll do for the next few minutes is, as you've foreshadowed, I'll recapitulate some of the key arguments of the book. And just as we noted, the new edition of the book, which is a paperback edition by Manchester University Press, has just been released. And it includes a substantial amount of new material covering the events of the past 2 years, right up to, I guess, the eve of the AUKUS Australia, US, UK nuclear submarine announcement, which is, you know, a really big development in the Indo-Pacific. So I will just go through a few of the key arguments from the original edition of the book, but also the updated edition. And I guess I'm interested in posing a few of the questions myself that I think all researchers on the Indo-Pacific have to think about if we are to make our work as relevant as possible for the strategic choices of our governments. So I think the core argument of the book is pretty plain in some ways. It's meant to be an articulation of the logic of an Indo-Pacific strategic concept spanning the two oceans, the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, as in many ways one strategic system, making a case that there's a historical validity to that way of thinking about the region. And a big part of the book is, if you like, reinterpreting the history of major power interaction across the Indo-Pacific as one strategic system, arguing, in fact, that the Asia-Pacific idea, while it was useful in the latter part of the 20th century, was a kind of a staging post on the way back to this larger two-ocean strategic system. The book makes an argument that a lot of the relevance of the Indo-Pacific in this century is about China, and it's about the way in which China's interests and influence and ambitions have expanded so rapidly across this two-ocean system, to the point that there are, if you like, some quasi-imperial designs that China has on dominating this larger strategic space. And then lastly, the book makes a case for balancing Chinese power through coalitions that actually leverage the expansive nature of our strategic geography, that bring in a diversity of Indo-Pacific powers, that bring in the middle players of the Indo-Pacific, like Australia, Japan, India, some of the Southeast Asian states as well, potentially a role for Europe, and we can come to that a bit later on, to help balance Chinese power and to really set limits to some very destabilizing ambitions. The book was published initially just before the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, and when we still had a Trump administration in the White House, and when the full character of China's wolf warrior diplomacy was not yet apparent. But what has actually surprised me in revisiting the book this year and in writing the new introduction that really brings the story up to date is how much the Indo-Pacific trends I identified in the book have actually remained valid. In fact, in some ways had accelerated. Objectively, you would argue that a transnational disaster like the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, was an opportunity for China to revisit its calculations about great power ambition, about strategic struggle and competition with other states, and to put forward a more cooperative vision, a less confrontational vision, and so forth. You would have thought that the pandemic and its economic and societal impacts on all of our countries could have actually slowed down or even turned the tide against this process to great power competition in the Indo-Pacific. But of course, the reality has been quite the opposite, and we've seen a doubling down on strategic competition and confrontation by China. We've seen an acceleration of a lot of the self-strengthening, the balancing the coalition building by others. We've seen particularly the dramatic rise of the Quad in the past 2 years. Now, a permanent, if you like, leaders level summit with a very broad agenda. We've seen countries like Australia take a very robust position in strengthening our own defence capabilities. Our Prime Minister talks of a dark, dangerous, disorderly Indo-Pacific era that frankly reminds him of the 1930s, which is pretty unsettling, but may well have a degree of truth to it. We've seen China-India tensions worsening. We've seen the Biden administration, I think, commendably endorse an Indo-Pacific vision for American strategic policy, even though a fully fledged approach to that perhaps is not yet apparent in all domains of strategic competition. And I think trade in particular is one area where America is going to have to rise, if you like, to the contest a bit more. I will note as a concluding point the controversy of AUKUS, the Australia, US, UK submarine deal, and the impact that's had on relations with France, the impact that's had on attitudes in Southeast Asia and so forth. We'll come back to that, but I'll just leave you with this little argument, which is that despite the fact that AUKUS is problematic in some ways because it is, if you like, accentuating differing Indo-Pacific visions of a number of our countries. And in particular, France seems to be articulating something quite different at the moment to the recognition of strategic competition that Australia is facing. Nonetheless, it's striking that what we're seeing with AUKUS is a contest over what the Indo-Pacific means for our strategic settings. It's not an argument against the actual idea of the Indo-Pacific as a basis for managing Chinese power. So I guess, if there are any silver linings in that debate, that is one of them. But I'm very interested in our discussion, perhaps to go to the hard strategic consequences of all of this. I will stop there.
Thank you, Professor Metcalf, for your wonderful presentation and your insight. For me, actually, the title is the appealing and fascinating. And of course, your scholarship and your words are insightful for those who are working in this, especially Indo-Pacific geopolitics. And when I was reading the past, you divided your book in 3 sections, past, present, and future. When I was reading the past submerged history of Asia, so it took me to my high school days when I read the history about dynasties that was not related to India, but it was the Indian subcontinent, or more than that. You talked about Chola dynasty, then Delhi Sultanate, and then the British Empire. And what I understood from this, you are trying to say that the geographical descriptor Indo-Pacific Empire is not new, but it existed there in the past. So my first question is, what's in name? In page 3, you put the heading, there is a heading, what is in name? What does this neo-geographical descriptor Indo-Pacific means to you? How do you relate to the empire in the 21st century?
Well, thank you, Indu. There's a lot there. There's a few good questions wrapped up in that. Look, the history for me as a researcher was the most fascinating part of the book to write, because I actually began the book with an idea about the contemporary strategic dynamic, the fact that I think we are in a multipolar system in the Indo-Pacific. We're in a system of both connectivity and contestation across this expansive 2-ocean system. And incidentally, it is a region that is too large for any one country to dominate. I think that is the mistake that China is making there. But in researching the history, I really began with a hypothesis that there was if you like, a subterranean or submerged evidence that many societies, many civilizations, many empires had tried to operate across this two-ocean system. In other words, that the artificial distinction of the late 20th century, where you have an East Asian strategic system here, a South Asian strategic system there, an Indian Ocean here, a Pacific Ocean there, and the two have very little to do with each other. That was really false. And what surprised me was, in fact, how frequently the historical record matched my hypothesis. I mean, of course, there are arguments both ways. Of course, you know, in ancient times, China was much more dominant or sought to be dominant in quite a narrow East Asian periphery. But if you do take a view that privileges the maritime and that looks at the maritime civilizations in Southeast Asia and in South India in particular, you see those civilizations consistently operating at the boundaries of the Indian and Pacific Oceans and seeking to dominate what we would today consider to be the choke points of maritime Southeast Asia. We see a similar dynamic when European empires move onto the scene. We see briefly such a dynamic when China in the early 15th century sent its treasure fleets to the Indian Ocean, the Zheng He fleets, and China very briefly attempted to build a maritime Indo-Pacific empire. And so, look, I did find some fascinating resonances from history, and I guess I drew some lessons as well, which I think are important lessons for China today, and that is that hegemony in this region just doesn't work in the long run.
Thank you, Professor. I have two questions related to the first one. The first, like I'm going to ask about the Australia's role and priorities in the shift in paradigm from the Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific. Do you see any difference in terms of strategy, diplomacy, alliance, and partners?
Look, a lot of difference. I mean, I think one of the criticisms of my book, actually, it's a friendly criticism made by an Australian colleague, is that the book doesn't say enough about Australia. In other words, I've written a book for an international audience about the Indo-Pacific, and it includes a little bit of the Australian story, but maybe it doesn't make Australia so central to the story. Interestingly, though, Australia has been a diplomatic pioneer on the Indo-Pacific, and I try to accentuate that a little bit more in the new edition of the book. You know, going back 10, 15 years, Australia was one of the first countries to think in this way. I mean, there was certainly such thinking in Japan. I think Shinzo Abe was a particular leader in this way. But Australia was the first government to formally redefine the region as the Indo-Pacific and to talk about all of our strategic policy in an Indo-Pacific lens. That was our defence white paper in 2013, 8 years ago, and you can see traces of that right through Australia's strategic policy settings ever since. It does mean a lot more than a name. I think going back to your earlier question, what's in a name? Because when I grew up in the Australian policy community in the 1990s, we had a very narrow view of our region. It barely touched the Indian Ocean. There was a blind spot, frankly, with regard to India, and my own posting to India, to New Delhi from 2000 to 2003, I hope was somewhat helpful in correcting that blind spot. But now that Australia recognises the Indo-Pacific as our strategic environment, it means that our diplomacy, our development of military capabilities, our partnership building, our alliance building is much more focused on the whole of our maritime periphery, not only looking north and looking to our east. But I should emphasise this is not about Australia trying to do everything on its own. We are a middle power. And so one of the really striking sort of phenomena of Australia's Indo-Pacific strategy has been the emphasis placed on partnership building. The Quad, the trilaterals, particularly with India, Japan, the United States, our cultivation of a wide range of partners, Australia's activism in promoting Indo-Pacific thinking in Southeast Asia, all of those have been characteristics of this policy shift. And finally, a very comprehensive turn to a maritime strategy for our Defence Force. And that doesn't mean that the Army doesn't matter, but it does mean that all of the Australian services are now looking together at how we can achieve strategic effects in the maritime environment, whether it's with surface vessels, whether it's with surveillance, whether it's with strike, or indeed in the long run with submarines.
Thank you, Professor. Now my next question is related to the first one and the second one. Like, it's related to the name. Like, we are just that this is a point of discussion, that why Indo-Pacific, from Asia Pacific to Indo-Pacific. Like, when I talk about my Southeast Asian friends, then they are taking it like, why the name change? Like, it's about America, or it's about the great powers, or it's about the contestation. So my question is to you, like you mentioned in your book, quote, an Indian Ocean center of gravity, unquote, since 5th century BCE and 3rd century BCE, from the Chola dynasty and so on. How do you see India's role in present power contestation in the Indo-Pacific, given the difference in opinions, concerns about AUKUS agreement in India's strategic community? And you also mentioned, like at page 57, I'm reading it here, like what I understood here, that the 2 World War, that they happened in Europe, but the suffering of in terms of the soldiers and in terms of other thing is in this Indo-Pacific region. There was a lot more suffering in this Indo-Pacific region in those 2 World Wars, because the British, that was the imperial, that was under the British imperialism. So like I just want to read it from here. The British Indian Army in the Second World War, the largest volunteer force in history, was essential to resisting and rolling back Japan forces with 700,000 troops in Southeast Asia alone. So from this region, how do you see that India's role, like we know that there's a Quad and then AUKUS. What do you think?
Thank you. Look, that's a really rich set of questions. And in fact, just an acknowledgement up front, a friend and colleague who's been very influential in my thinking on this is Raja Mohan, who's known to many of you, Dr. C. Raja Mohan from India. And in fact, I very well remember first working with him, 20 years ago or more, on understanding India's role as a strategic actor. And in fact, that's a point that he very eloquently argues as well, the underappreciated role of Indian forces in the defeat of Imperial Japan in the Second World War. But the broader point is that when I talk about a centre of gravity, which is not just the Indian Ocean, but of course maritime, really the maritime zone bordering South India and Southeast Asia. I mean, the importance of the Bay of Bengal, for example. I'm not just talking about India's strategic weight. I'm talking also about the interest that China takes in that region. The fact that ever since at least 2004, when the Chinese leadership spoke of the Malacca dilemma, China's recognition that if it's going to dominate the region and if it's going to, in a non-market way, achieve, I guess, economic advantage for its internal development, it's going to have a security presence across the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So in some ways, the centrality of those zones is a function of China's rise just as much as it's a function of the growing importance of India. India is an important strategic actor, but I'm not making a case that India is equal to China in weight, or even that it will be anytime soon. It doesn't need to be. India needs to simply protect its own interests. The other point that I'd make is that, yes, some friends and colleagues, particularly in Southeast Asia, will ask questions, why the Indo-Pacific, and does this deprivilege or or delegitimize the idea of Asia or the centrality of Southeast Asia in our regional strategic and diplomatic frameworks? And the short answer to that is no. The short answer is that, frankly, the Indo-Pacific is an Asia-centric maritime region. If we really wanted to add some more words to that compound, we could say Indo-Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific-Asia. And in fact, I think Indo-PACOM in Honolulu has occasionally used that formulation. But I think the Asia is implicit in Indo-Pacific, just as the Europe is implicit in North Atlantic. And I think that this is recognised, in fact, more than some of us realise. You think about Indonesia. Indonesia has been a really powerful driver of an Indo-Pacific vision in ASEAN and Indonesia's own Indo-Pacific vision. Indonesia is an absolutely central country to the Indo-Pacific in every sense. And the Indonesian government is perfectly comfortable with the term and concept of the Indo-Pacific. So I think we can be reasonably comfortable there, but it's certainly not about delegitimizing Asia or somehow challenging ASEAN centrality. It's about recognizing that the interests and the stakes of many powers, including the great powers, including all of the trading and seafaring nations, including countries like Australia, those interests and stakes are engaged and need to engage with an Asia-centric region. But what happens in the Indo-Pacific, what happens in the South China Sea is our business too.
Thank you, Professor. Now, I see a question from, I want to take the question from the chat box. Mr. Powell, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. First of all, hello, Rory. I haven't seen you since Canberra. While I was there in the US Embassy, we generally downplayed Cold War analogies. In fact, I remember Ambassador Culverhouse was emphatic that he rejected Cold War analogies vis-a-vis China. I wonder if what you think about as events progress and China becomes more aggressive and its malign activities sort of come to the international attention more and more palpably. Do you think the Cold War analogies are gaining in usefulness? Do you think that they, both as an intellectual or an academic matter, and even as a statecraft tool in terms of concentrating international attention on the problem of China's malign activities?
Thanks, Ray, and good to see you. Yeah, look, I think there are many historical analogies that are useful as long as we know how to use them, we put them in perspective, and we don't pretend that this is a perfect replay or an identical replay of some other era, whether it's the Cold War, the Second World War, the 1930s, 1914, the Concert of Europe, you name it. There are plenty of historical analogies that we can draw on. And in fact, part of the argument in my book is that some of the most important historical analogies for understanding the Indo-Pacific today can actually be found in the Indo-Pacific. It's not always European templates that can be transposed. And that's incidentally, one reason why, although I respect the quality of his arguments, I disagree with my Australian colleague, Hugh White, who applies overwhelmingly European concert of powers sort of models onto Asia. But yes, there's some resonance from the Cold War, and that resonance will increase according to China's choices. So I think the argument that a lot of us made 2 or 3 years ago, 5, 10 years ago, that it's not the Cold War, we shouldn't use that language. I mean, I used to be very clear at saying we should not use the word containment when we talk about China policy, for example, because we're not seeking, neither side is seeking economic advantage. It's purely, I guess, in a security and military sense. Well, we do have to revisit all of those arguments. I'm not saying that we've gone all the way yet to a new Cold War, but it's China's choices to make this fully fledged geoeconomic competition, to bring a more ideologically overlay, to mobilize its people ideologically as it's doing now, that are going to encourage more Cold War thinking, not some relatively modest steps that, you know, countries like ours have taken in building coalitions that could become maybe alliances later on. You know, the Quad is less evidence of a new Cold War than is the ideological mobilization we're seeing in China. So look, let's draw the lessons, but let's also try to find, in my view, a new lexicon. You know, I wouldn't say it's cold peace or hot peace or whatever it is, but, you know, it's not, thankfully, yet fully fledged military confrontation, nor is it simply the same as the last Cold War. So, but look, you know, my book originally talked about the choice between a cooperative and a competitive struggle-based Indo-Pacific future. And with each passing year of the past 10 years, it's looked more like the latter. But there are still ways, I think, in which we can at least arrest that deterioration or gradually turn back the dial. And that's where trying to help China identify the limits to its imperial project is in everyone's interests.
Do you mind if I follow up?
I don't mind, Chair.
As long as it's okay. Yeah, so a couple of things you said. So I guess one would be, so you brought up the idea of revisiting the idea of containment. It almost seems like we have been embarked on that journey into talking more openly about containment for quite a while. And I almost feel like we've sort of been talking behind closed doors about containment for a while. We just don't say it out in the open. And I wonder if you share that view. And secondly, well, let me leave you with that one first.
Yeah, look, and I'm still reluctant to go all the way to calling it or endorsing it as a fully fledged containment strategy, precisely because that does play into China's hands in some ways. That's the accusation China's made all along. You know, I think for most of the time China's used that accusation, it's never been even remotely true. And now that we do recognise that there needs to be a geoeconomic and a technology edge to our strategic competition with China, we probably need to find a new way of defining it, because we still, I think, want to identify ways in which, at least from an Australian perspective and from a personal perspective, we still want to find ways in which there's mutual benefit to economic relations with China, but we need to quarantine those elements of the economic relationship which are giving China strategic advantage from those elements which ideally are not. So it's, whatever it is, it's going to be more sophisticated than the Cold War containment strategy, and therefore we need to find a new way of describing it. But I do agree that, as has been happening, our governments need to be open in acknowledging that there is geoeconomic strategic competition with China occurring. And even here in Australia, where we've often been, you know, labelled as having this extraordinary economic or trade reliance on China, the wake-up call of the Chinese economic coercion over the past 2 years has actually given our government, frankly, the courage to say openly, we are in an age of geoeconomic strategic competition. We have a treasurer now who talks about national economic resilience against economic coercion, and the diversification of our economic relations as being probably, you know, his number one preoccupation. And that's a major change from just a few years ago.
Thanks, Rory.
Thank you, Professor. My question is, like, you advocate for the middle of the road approach, what you call conditional engagement. In the Indo-Pacific, as you provide the steps of appeasement and provocation. However, it seems events are pushing the world increasingly towards the latter trap. Have we moved beyond a point when leaders can realistically pursue conditional engagement without it turning into a Chamberlain-esque moment that will further embolden Beijing?
So thank you. Indu, that's useful. I mean, that is definitely based on a close reading of the final chapter of my book, where I set out a typology of, our strategic choices in dealing with the China challenge. But I try to emphasize that there's not going to be, any one instrument or one tool in the kit that we can use for all purposes. Deterrence is essential, but it can't be the only element of our posture. Engagement, we should try, but with our eyes open and without compromising sovereignty, values, and so forth. And I do experiment with ideas like, conditional engagement or incorporation as a middle way between accommodation and capitulation accommodation and capitulation on the one hand, and confrontation and conflict on the other hand. But I do think that you've got a point, that is, the dial has been moving, and China has been choosing to move the dial year by year. And the last 2 years, things have just gotten worse, so that engagement is harder. The conditions that we set, for a country like Australia, there should be a whole lot of non-negotiable conditions for our engagement with China. Conditions related to the preservation of our liberal democratic values and identity, the protection of our equal sovereignty as a nation, even though we're a much smaller nation than China. Those are still the right conditions. China is choosing to ignore those conditions, or at least it has been, if you look at the ultimatum that China laid down to Australia last year, when it instituted economic coercion. A set of 14 points that very explicitly stated the kinds of quite grotesque compromises that democracies and middle powers will have to make if we're going to, have policies that are acceptable to the current Chinese leadership. And Australia has very clearly pushed back and said, no, we ignore those conditions that you set. We don't compromise on our core interests, values, and identity. And I think more and more countries and democracies are doing that. So I still think the principle of conditional engagement is right. And I think it accords with the competitive coexistence argument that the Biden administration uses to frame its China policy. And incidentally, conditional competitive coexistence is a term that I've been arguing for some years. That was in the original edition of my book as well. So that's all right. But if China is choosing to make its demands higher, or not to, if you like, respect the conditions that we apply to our engagement policy, then yes, it does get more difficult. And I think that self-respecting middle power governments will increasingly look to our allies and partners, look to diversify our economic relations, and not compromise further with China. I think the Australian experience is worth studying in that regard, because so far Australia has endured and weathered Chinese economic coercion much more effectively than some people had assumed, many observers had assumed, and that's getting quite frustrating for China. A weakness in this whole approach that I'm arguing is that the more that we see division and discord among the middle powers, among the Indo-Pacific democracies, the harder it's going to be for us to maintain this position. So in that regard, thank goodness for the degree of US leadership that we have seen. And, I think we desperately need more of it.
Thank you, Professor. I'm taking the next question from the chat box, and I believe it's from Ashish. Given the diversity, the question says, so given the diversity and rich history of conflicts and alliances in the region, who do you think can rule the empire in a globalized world order? How do you see acceptance or denial for a distant friend, near shore friend, weak adversary, or local expansionist powers from countries in the region?
That's a big one. Look, I make the argument in my book that hegemony in this two-ocean system is not going to succeed in the long run. I think China's ambition is some kind of hegemony in the Indo-Pacific. I don't necessarily think there's a sort of forensically detailed master plan. I think if you study the history of most empires, especially, for example, the colonial European empires, they often began more as commercial activities that then devolved or evolved into military and political arrangements rather than the other way around. And I think to some extent, there's elements of that in the Belt and Road. So, I think China is having a kind of rapid imperial power play across the Indo-Pacific, but I do argue that it's going to go wrong in various ways. It's going to be very difficult for China to sustain this 20, 30, 40 years from now. What's the alternative? I don't adhere to a sort of simplistic concept of American primacy. I think American preeminence is a really important idea and value. And I think that the work that, for example, Myra Rapp Hooper has done, and Myra is now in the US in the administration, but she's done some really interesting writings distinguishing primacy from preeminence. And preeminence is a more sophisticated and qualified, if you like, variant on primacy. It does not mean that the United States needs to dominate every issue in every theatre every time. It can be a little bit more selective than that. I think US leadership with coalitions of allies and partners where the coalitions do more for their own security is our best option. How that plays out in the Indo-Pacific remains to some extent unknown, but the imperative is on Japan, India, Australia, the Quad in particular, and potentially others, all to contribute more, because we have a say, we have agency in shaping what that new arrangement looks like. I would argue that in extreme circumstances, without the United States being so engaged in the Indo-Pacific, then we're in for many years of trouble. But even with the US less engaged in the Indo-Pacific 20, 30 years from now, this is going to be a different region. It's still going to be difficult for China to dominate, in my opinion.
Thanks, Professor. The next question is from Sherry Simpson. Do you see a role for Australia in building the capacity and strength of Southeast Asia as a power in the region?
Look, I think building capacity in Southeast Asia is a very high priority, not only for Australia, but for many countries. I think Japan has been quietly doing it for many years and effectively. Australia coordinates quietly with Japan on that. When I talk to my European friends about their Indo-Pacific strategies, including to the British for that matter, I like to remind that this is not primarily or even solely or primarily about your military and security presence. It's about you being credible partners to provide alternatives, to work with us to provide alternatives to China for Southeast Asian countries, Indian Ocean countries, South Pacific countries, in building their capacity, whether it's in their security forces, whether it's in their maritime surveillance, whether it's in their governance and their ability to make use of investment, infrastructure and digital technologies. Australia continues to play a big role there, but we can't do it alone. And I would note also that Australia places a very special priority on the South Pacific, which is the sub-region of the Indo-Pacific, where I would argue Australia is the principal balancer of China.
Thank you, Professor. You divided your book in 3 parts: past, present, and future. In the last part, you talked about deterrence. I'm quoting you here, if nuclear weapons become the lone pillar for deterring China in the ocean of ambiguity between peace and Armageddon, then the contest is lost, unquote. How do you see the recent AUKUS agreement, which includes a nuclear submarine deal, in the context of deterrence in the region?
Thank you. Look, that makes 2 different points in my opinion, and I would slightly differentiate. In fact, I would actively differentiate those points. Firstly, I still argue that we can't allow the contest with China to be only or primarily at the nuclear level. I mean, China is modernizing its nuclear arsenal quite clearly. China takes nuclear capability seriously. The recent Pentagon report reinforces that. And the United States retains nuclear superiority. But I think that all of China's actions so far suggest that its threats, its coercion, its risk, it will do everything it can below nuclear thresholds. AUKUS is something different. I mean, the AUKUS submarine element, the idea that Australia will acquire nuclear-powered submarines, not nuclear weapons, and that's an absolute distinction that we must all understand. For Australia to have nuclear-powered submarines means that Australia will be able to more effectively patrol and protect and deter in our very large strategic geography. And I would argue that in the long run, that's actually good for pretty much all of our neighbours, friends and partners. I mean, even a country like Japan, which was hoping to sell us conventional submarines 6 years ago until the French won that contract away from them. You know, Japan, I suspect, would be quite happy to see an Australia with nuclear-powered submarines, because it means our Navy can be active, you know, in the far reaches of the Pacific and in the North Pacific. But I do think we have a challenging diplomatic task ahead to explain and persuade our friends in Southeast Asia why a stronger Australia is good for them too, partly because there is a very active Chinese propaganda campaign to confuse the issue of AUKUS with nuclear proliferation, and to, I think, quite absurdly claim that the AUKUS response to China's military modernisation is somehow the cause of an arms race, when really it's a symptom of a contest that China has been driving.
Thank you, Professor. I have another question in the chat box from Nimaya. Would you like to ask your question?
Sure. So I was just wondering what if you think that the B3W initiative will be able to successfully offer an alternative to the BRI in countries where the BRI has a strong presence for quite a long time and where China actually has quite a strong political influence?
Yeah, look, thank you. And I think when we think about the alternatives and competitors to the BRI, we can't think about just one thing. I mean, the Build Back Better World initiative, you know, is the new, at this stage, largely headline. I haven't seen a lot of detail on the substance, but the new headline that came out of, I think, the Cornwall Summit a few months ago. We've also got a thing called the Blue Dot Network, which was all about certification and standards. And we've got various infrastructure initiatives by the United States, by Japan, by Australia, trilaterally by the three of us, other activities by India, Europe, and so on. There's a whole range of alternatives. And don't forget that in the end, it's not as if the BRI and its lending is the only game in town. There's lots, you know, there's been lots of Japanese-led infrastructure and investment in Southeast Asia for many, many years. In fact, the accumulation of that, the stock of that is still greater than the stock of Chinese infrastructure investment in Southeast Asia. So the question for me is, how do we make all of these other elements cohere and work together? And how do we compete intelligently with China, not competing on the same terms? It should not be simply in the scale of lending or in the scale of concrete and steel and the pace of crude infrastructure development, but it should be focusing on areas where liberal democracies have advantages and can make a qualitative difference. I think digital connectivity, absolutely. I think resource management, resource stewardship, you know, green shipping, for example, absolutely. And I think especially education and empowerment of local communities, local governments, officials, journalists in countries right across the Indo-Pacific, so that in some instances they can take Chinese money, but they do it with their eyes open. I think that's just as useful a way of diluting the strategic impact of the Belt and Road as simply throwing new loans out into the region, when in many cases, a lot of these countries are going to struggle to service the loans and the debt that the BRI has already imposed upon them.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Powell, would you like to ask you a question about Quad?
Hi, yeah, sure. It's me again. So Rory, I was curious if you had a view on whether, well, first of all, do you have a view on how exactly would you define what the Quad is now? And should it be formally defined so as to guide and direct its development, or should it be allowed to continue to develop organically and let it define itself?
Thanks, Ray, and I will answer that. And just a note to Indu, I'm going to have to leave a little bit early. I probably have to leave in about 10 or 15 minutes. So if there are other questions, I'm very happy after this one for you to give me all of them, and I'll do my best to give you one sort of collected answer, if that's okay. But Ray, on the Quad, look, as I said, I'm impressed with the development, rapid evolution of the Quad, driven overwhelmingly by China. The Quad was made in Beijing in a way because it's been, I think, particularly China's pressure on India in recent years that helped the Quad countries converge. It's not, as you know, it's not a military alliance. And I don't think it's going to move at any great speed to anything like a treaty alliance. I don't see India in particular joining a treaty alliance that involves the kind of security obligations that we see, under NATO or ANZUS. And the US, Australia, and Japan already have very good alliance relationships with each other that I think is almost effectively a trilateral alliance in any case. So I actually see the Quad partly as a core group on a whole range of issues, and that goes back to the origins of the Quad after the tsunami in 2004, where it was a core group of responders to disaster. I think it's smart that the Quad is a loose arrangement, is publicly a loose arrangement, but privately an increasingly tight arrangement on, vaccines, climate, critical technologies in particular. And it's looking for ways to combine the weight of these four countries with presenting a united front and signalling that we're actually open to working with others. I honestly think that's enough for now. And I think that a further hardening of the Quad in a military sense will be entirely up to China. Meanwhile, it's great that Malabar is now an exercise that includes Australia. Yes, it's great to have Quad militaries train together. It would be good to have, for example, semi-formal, if you like, intelligence sharing, or at least intelligence assessment relationships being shared among the Quad countries. But I think the last thing we need to do is put at risk any of the political consensus we've built in our four countries to get the Quad to where it is today. And I think instead, ironically, with AUKUS on the scene now, a lot of China's propaganda and frustration is now focused on that. And suddenly the Quad has become normalized, and I would say the fact that the Quad is now normalized and I think increasingly accepted and respected in Southeast Asia and Europe is a great success.
Thank you, Professor. And now, looking at the time constraint, I would like to invite Dr. Ernest Gunasekara Rockwell. Doc.
Yeah, I just want to say a huge thanks to Professor Medcalf for a fantastic presentation. You provided us a great insight into what your book is all about, and then tackled all of the difficult questions that were tossed your way with aplomb. And it's always a pleasure to have any interaction with you. And we want to give you a standing invitation to publish in the journal, or to interact with the consortium in any way that you'd like to. And again, just thank you, and I'll hand it back over to Indu.
Thank you, that's very kind.
At this point, I would like to wrap up here, and I would like to offer the thanks to our operation team who helped us in making this event happen, and thank you all attendees for joining today. Thank you, Professor Metcalf, for your valuable time and for your wonderful insight. Please stay tuned for our next book talk titled Winning and Losing the Nuclear Peace, The Rise, Demise, and Revival of Arms Control, authored by Mr. Michael Crepon, co-founder Stimson Center, on December 8th. Thank you, everyone. Have a great time.
Thank you very much, and best wishes.
Thank you.